I want to run through some analysis that Baringa has been doing on the historical costs and benefits of wind deployment in Ireland, looking at the period from 2000 to 2020. And I'll take you through some of the key messages and a little bit around the methodology and what we've been doing in that area. First, a couple of very brief words about Baringa. Many of you will be familiar with us. We're a management consultancy of about 600 people, and we have offices in London, Dublin, Middle East, Australia, and New York. We have a long history working in the Irish market, so we were deeply involved in the initial design of SEM, and the rollout of that over, 10 years ago now. And we've been very closely involved in ISEM, working on the regulatory side with AirGrid, and also with many commercial clients, advising on the implementation of ISEM and how to manage the risks involved with that. Many of you will have seen the public report that was released about a week or so back now. So the 70 by 30 analysis that Baringa carried out, and this was looking forwards over the next 10, 15 years out to 2030, and was looking at the net end consumer cost or benefit of deployment of renewables and wind to reach a 70% renewable electricity target by 2030. And our analysis showed that if you can deliver onshore wind for a levelized cost of 60 euros per megawatt hour in Ireland, then actually the overall impact, financial impact on end consumers in Ireland was net neutral of that level of deployment. And actually, if you can beat that 60 euros per megawatt hour levelized cost, if you can get below that, then you get a net benefit, a financial benefit to end consumers of that level of wind deployment. And that was backed by a very detailed analysis where we were modeling on an hourly basis the power market and the constraints in the system in Ireland. And we overlaid also analysis of the network costs, ancillary service DS3 costs, and capacity market savings and costs as well. So that was the forward-looking view. The question then is, what about the deployment of wind to date in Ireland? And if you look at those same set of potential cost or benefit line items, how do they translate to the wind that has actually been deployed in the Irish market so far? And how do they stack up using the same approach that we looked at for that forward-looking study? So we deployed the same modelling platform, and we looked at that largely historical period in Ireland to ask that question: what has the impact been in reality for end consumers? So I'm going to step through in this talk some of the key messages from that work. I'm going to talk a little bit about the approach, but I think let's start with the kind of headline key messages. So our analysis suggests that over that 20-year period, the net financial cost of wind to end consumers has been about 100 million euros in total. So that amounts to the equivalent of around €1 per household per year over that period. And that's clearly significantly less than the PSO cost, which is very much the figure which is often front and central when wind is discussed in political circles or in the media. That PSO figure, which is relatively substantial, that PSO cost, in our analysis, around 2 billion euros over that period. But that's really just one side of the story. And when you factor in particular, the wholesale energy cost savings, that really does help to offset what are often the kind of headline costs associated with wind deployment. So I'll go through some of these components, particularly the more major ones, in a bit more detail, but just to run through the elements of costs and benefits that we considered in our analysis. So on the cost side, by far the most material is that res support. So the cost of refit, the cost of AER going back to the early 2000s. We looked at the network costs, so the cost of reinforcing the network in order to facilitate and integrate wind over that period. We looked at constraint costs, so these are the costs that are incurred by the system operator in order to maintain system security with higher levels of wind deployment. So these tend to be costs associated with turning on or turning up thermal power stations in order to maintain the required system stability parameters. And then we looked at ancillary services. So I've called this DS3. Of course, historically it wasn't DS3, but these are ancillary service costs which have been incurred, again, in order to accommodate wind on the system. So largely in recent years, this has been about increasing the so-called SNSP limit, so the limit on the instantaneous amount of renewables that you can have generating at any one time. And increasing that has been key to integrating more renewables, but that has come with a cost. On the savings side then, as I say, the wholesale cost savings I'll talk about in a bit more detail, but well over 2 billion euros saved in that item alone. On top of that, capacity market savings. So wind in Ireland does deliver a tangible capacity contribution. So it has a tangible contribution to maintaining security of supply. And by having the level of wind that we've seen historically on the system, that has avoided the need for a certain amount of additional capacity. And through the formula that's been used historically in SEM to set the capacity payment pot size, the presence of wind has resulted in a net saving on the capacity payment side. And then the final component that we looked at, the grey component in the chart here, was EU non-compliance savings. So these are avoided EU non-compliance costs, and these are costs that would have been incurred if the shortfall versus the 2020 targets had been greater than it will be already. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we factored in that element in a second. So it's certainly true that wind support costs have been material in Ireland, and we've calculated it in detail what the AER and then refit support costs have looked like over that period, and I've popped this on the chart here. You can see that those costs have ramped up, particularly through the early 2010s. So those costs were not really significant until that early 2010 period, partly because there were very high power prices in 2008, partly 2009 as well. Then we've seen a ramp up as we have more wind deployed under refit. Those costs have grown over time, tempered slightly by increasing power prices over recent years. But the picture becomes much more nuanced once you add in those other components that we've looked at. And here I've broken out that high-level cumulative total into the individual contributions on an annual basis of each of the components that we've looked at here. And you can see that there is that substantial contribution from wholesale cost savings. So the pink bars below the zero line on the left-hand side. That has fluctuated quite a bit from year to year, depending on things like commodity price movements and also the level of wind output, so how windy a year it's been. But generally the trend has been pretty firmly towards that increasing. I'll show a little bit later on that we've quantified, at least based on the history, what the relationship has been between wind output, so the level of terawatt-hour output in Ireland in a particular year, and the reduction in the power price. And that reduction is driven really by the so-called merit order effect of wind. So the fact that if you've got wind generating at a cost of production which is close to zero, then that means that you displace some of the more expensive gas-fired plants, typically, that would be needed to meet demand in a particular period. And that means that you end up with cheaper plants setting the price because you have that wind output in any particular period that you look at. And generally, our analysis shows that high power prices are very key in terms of reducing the net cost of wind. And in many ways, that's quite an obvious statement, but there are a few layers of impact that high power prices have. So the first is the fact that if you have a high power price, the top-up that is required under refit in particular is greatly reduced. And we saw, for example, in 2008, wholesale power prices were up at the 80 euro per megawatt hour level. So refit projects were receiving no subsidy. In fact, they had an upside situation where they were achieving already in excess of the refit floor price simply through the market revenues. And therefore, there were no support costs for wind essentially in that year. On the other hand, lower wholesale price year have incurred higher support costs. And you can see here we've plotted a curve of the relationship between the wholesale price and the net cost or benefit of wind to the end consumer in Ireland in a particular year. So this is including all of those costs and benefits, but you can see that there is a very clear linkage between the underlying power price and the outcome from the end consumer side. 2008, very much an outlier, but a big benefit to end consumers in that year. And we've seen then around 2010, 2013, again, relatively high power prices and a relatively favorable net position for the end consumer. So I mentioned earlier that one of the benefits that we'd factored into our analysis was avoided EU non-compliance costs. And this was a very difficult area to look at because the exact nature of these non-compliance costs is not yet known. The way they'll be levied, the magnitude of them, and indeed the period of time over which they'll apply is still up in the air. We tried to take a reasonably conservative view of this, and therefore we based our figures on SEAI numbers. So the SEAI estimated in a report that's publicly available that the compliance costs are likely to be somewhere in the range 65 million to 130 million euros per percentage point shortfall on the overall binding target. And that binding target for Ireland is 16% renewable energy. So SEAI believe that there will be a shortfall on that target. They think it will be around the 13% level. In our analysis, we stripped out the wind contribution and calculated that without wind build, which has happened over the last 20 years, that share, that RES share, would be about 7 percentage points lower. So we'd be looking at something like a 6% RES level in 2020. And therefore, just taking the midpoint of the SEAI estimated costs and applying it to those 7 percentage points, we get an avoided non-compliance cost of around 660 million euros. We've just applied this as a one-off cost. So we've put that in as a one-time non-compliance cost in 2020. But as I say, it's very plausible that this may end up applying in more than 1 year, or indeed for as long as the non-compliance situation persists. So there are certainly more pessimistic outcomes for non-compliance costs, but therefore more optimistic outlooks for the contribution of wind than we've factored in here. So those are the financial benefits, but our analysis also provided a good view of some of the other societal benefits that have been driven by wind deployment. For example, wind generation deployed to date has avoided around 116 terawatt hours of gas burn, and that alone has saved around 2.5 billion euros purely in fuel costs in the power sector. And you can see on the cumulative chart there how that's stacked up over time. And that's simply that impact of wind in displacing gas-fired generation, particularly high-cost gas-fired generation from the top end of the merit order stack. There's also been a saving on the coal side, but this has been quite a bit more moderate than gas, for the reason that coal-fired generation typically, over the period we've looked at, has been quite a bit cheaper than gas-fired generation, and therefore it's the gas-fired generators who have been displaced first by wind, and there hasn't been a huge amount of displacement of coal, although there has been some. Expanding that then to the carbon emission savings, so the wind to date has avoided around 40 million tonnes of carbon dioxide emissions across the island, and around 33 million tonnes of that attributable to the Republic of Ireland. And you can see again, I've just popped on a chart the cumulative build-up of that emission saving, and also our projections of both the historical emissions and then projections of how that would have looked without the wind deployment. Just a couple of words on how we actually did the analysis. So underpinning this is modelling which has been carried out with our in-house SEM market model. So this is a very detailed hourly dispatch model which covers both the unconstrained market and the market with the constraints in place. What we did is to run that model in so-called backcast mode. So this involves trying to replicate historical outturn in the market, and we do this by plugging in actual outturn values for a lot of the key inputs. So things like demand, commodity prices, carbon prices, interconnector flows, wind output. All of that is plugged into the model. Then we run the model, and the model spits out what it thinks the wholesale price should have been historically. And I've plotted in the left-hand chart here the match between that backcasted wholesale price and the actual wholesale price in the market. And there may be people in the room who have attempted this kind of backcasting process before. It's something that always strikes fear into the hearts of consultants, because it really exposes any kind of issues with the model. Because if you put in real data and you're not getting the actual power price out, then that's a bit of a red flag. But we were very pleased with the level of match here. It's actually much better than we were expecting. And so, yeah, I don't know whether the left-hand chart looks impressive or not, but in a very nerdy way, we were quite pleased with how that left-hand chart looked. And then on the right-hand chart, what I've showed is that backcast result, so our simulation replicating the actual outturn with the wind in place. What we then did was to strip out the historical wind build from our model. So we removed it, hypothetically looking at that scenario when none of that wind has been deployed. We kept the same security standard, so when needed, we added in additional fossil-fueled plant in order to look at the two scenarios on a fair and consistent basis. And you can see on the right-hand side then the delta between those two outcomes. So we've got the no wind case with the higher power prices, and then we've got the backcast case with the blue line there. And that was the way we sort of extracted this delta and the impact of wind in the modelling. And just one snapshot of some of the detailed data that came out of that exercise. This shows the impact of wind generation, so the terawatt hour output of wind in a particular year, and the percentage reduction in the power price which results from that. And you can see that there is a very consistent, or has been a very consistent, relationship between wind output and power price reduction in percentage terms. Now, one of the questions here is whether this can carry on indefinitely, and if one can extrapolate this line continuously. I think probably this doesn't continue to extrapolate indefinitely. And in fact, what we did in the forward-looking study, so the 2030, 70 by 30 work that we looked at, was to clearly roll forward this and look at much higher deployment of wind, and in the same way look at the impact on wholesale prices as well. And we get a slightly different relationship going forwards, but a very clear link between power price reduction and wind deployment. So just to summarize what we found so far, we've shown in our analysis that with around 4 gigawatts, over 4 gigawatts of wind deployed in the Republic of Ireland by 2020, the net financial cost to end consumers of that wind deployment over 20 years is around 100 million euros, equivalent to around €1 per household per year. And outside of the financial benefits, we've saved around 116 terawatt hours of natural gas burn and around 40 million tonnes of CO2 avoided across the island, and around 33 million of that in the Republic of Ireland. Now, I'll leave others to fill in the additional benefits of wind around job creation and the economy. That's not really our kind of area, but clearly this is a very positive starting point to look at the contribution to date and have a sort of balanced debate around what wind has brought to end consumers over that 20-year period. There will be more detail on this, which is made public in time. The assumptions that we've used for this, the approach, will be set out in quite a bit of detail, and that will be made public in due course in a similar way to the forward-looking work. So you'll be able to see in detail exactly how we've approached the analysis. So I'll leave it there for now, and then there'll be opportunity for questions at the end of the session.